The world of geeks and data and innovation and disruption all come together. Today, on episode number 111 of CXO Talk, we are thrilled to welcome Tim O'Reilly. I'm Michael Krigsman. I'm here with my fabulously glorious co-host, Vala Afshar. Hey, Vala, how are you?
Michael, thank you very much for that enthusiastic introduction, and I'm just honored and thrilled to have Tim on the show today. Welcome, Tim.
I'm very glad to be on the show, too. I've always wanted to be in the offices of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe with the click and clack, the Tapper brothers.
Vala, I'm not sure whether we were just complimented or insulted.
I don't know, but it doesn't matter.
It sounded good.
I'm still delighted.
And you say you're from Boston?
We are from Boston.
All right, sorry, we're too much in jokes. Okay, let's get to the show.
For us, this is it.
Tim, could you please briefly share with our audience a little bit about your background, although I think most people know, but we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I'm the founder and CEO of O'Reilly Media. Started my company now many years ago, a tech writing consulting firm, became a publisher, realized that most of my books were about topics that were coming from the fringes. Originally, we kind of made it big with early books about the internet and Unix and then open source software, and then I realized nobody was promoting this, so I started a conference business to help promote open source software. Somewhere along the line, I realized that a big part of our most effective marketing was a kind of activism. A guy named Brian Irwin, who'd been the director of activism for the Sierra Club, came to work for me, and about the time we published the whole Internet User's Guide, which is the most popular book on the internet. And we just went out there and he said, nobody cares about your products, pitch the idea. So we went out there and promoted the internet, and then of course people said, well, how do I learn more? And as part of that, we also discovered the World Wide Web early on, and we created a product called GNN, which we originally thought of as a demo of the World Wide Web that we would host in bookstores. And then we said, no, this isn't a demo, it's a product. And it really became the first web portal. We eventually sold it to AOL, and they probably screwed it up. So that was the end of that. But we were there before Yahoo. But I basically been around technology as somebody who's helped move the story forward. Our mission, as we kind of retrospectively defined it back around 2000, was changing the world by spreading the knowledge of innovators. And so that was something that tied together all the things we do. We have, we originally had publishing, and then we had events. Now we have much more of an integrated media model there. We launched Safari as an online subscription service for learning content, books and video. Back in 2000, we launched a small early-stage venture fund. But all these things are tied together by this notion of changing the world by spreading the knowledge of innovators. We find interesting people who are doing stuff that other people want to do, and then we try to figure out the best way to spread that knowledge so the future can happen faster and better.
Reading about your early stage venture fund, I was really struck by the fact that two things. One is you say that you do not seek the typical charismatic entrepreneur, and you say that the best way to get funded is a necessary, usually, way to get funded is to have some type of personal contact with you or the other people running the fund.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know where and when I said that. I have nothing against charismatic entrepreneurs. But what I will say, what we're most attracted to are people with ambitious ideas that have sort of some kernel of values to them. Like if you look at one of our investments, Planet Labs, they have this big vision. It's game changing in the way we're going to make data available. They're a microsatellite company. They're imaging the surface of the Earth every 24 hours. As opposed to, you get an image, once a year. This enables all kinds of new things. Super cool. Geeks out of NASA. We love the fact that they're just so into the technology. but we also loved that they had a game-changing vision. So it's really the combination of I think many of our founders are in fact charismatic, but what we're not interested in are people who are from the get-go gunning for the exits. I started my company with no venture capital, just with the idea that we would find customers, and we funded the business ever since by finding people who are willing to pay us for what we do. And I find that there are certainly times when venture capital is the right way to grow a business, but there's also a whole class of entrepreneur who is often overlooked. And we've recently launched something at OATV called Indie.vc, which is really how do we bring some of the skills and the perspective that a venture capitalist brings to a small company without this kind of model that says, we're going to put money in and we expect to get it out within the 10-year horizon of our fund because, we need to have an exit, and that's what this is all about. Instead to say we may be interested in building a company for the long term. I've been building O'Reilly Media for 35 years, and very successful company that is a really good thing to own. And we had a lot of opportunities when people have wanted to buy it, and we have not been interested. Now, that doesn't mean that would never happen, but we were obsessed with our mission, and we weren't obsessed with what's our next round of financing, and then when does that lead to an exit? And I have to say, there's far too many companies like that. Now, the really big successful ones have a mission, and you see companies with a mission, and you see entrepreneurs with a mission. And I guess I would say that mission, that sense of mission, is what we look for.
So your conferences and investments, is it fair to say, focus on, as Michael said, geeks and disruptive innovation, and certainly core values and mission matter. But can you talk a little bit about the word disruption? What does that mean to you? Is that a fair assessment of what your conference attracts? Okay, no, good.
I have to say, I find the religion of disruption to be somewhat offensive, quite frankly. I'm about creating things, and yes, disruption and creative destruction are part of a process, but you have to have a vision of what you're building. And we're going to disrupt this, we're going to disrupt that. First of all, it's a cheap thinking. When Logan Green started what became Lyft, he wasn't sitting there, and which really inspired a lot of parts of Uber that everybody, was so excited about. He wasn't into disrupting transformation. He was into creating a better transportation system. He was a transportation geek. He'd been on the transportation board in LA, and then he went to Zimbabwe and said, wow, we have a system here in the US that serves 5% of the people at massive losses. Over there, they've got this sort of jitney system that serves 95% of the people. It really works. Could we use technology to create something like that? And could we, because it was a very peer-to-peer. And then I think Uber came in with that really, wonderful vision, one-click vision. And then these two companies have been playing leapfrog in terms of innovation, but they're reinventing. And you look back, Henry Ford wasn't saying, I want to, disrupt the horse and buggy market. He had a forward-looking vision of the kind of society he wanted to create. And I think that, positive way of framing it is so much more powerful and important because, we're just going to go, break up this old market and won't that be great? Doesn't really tell us what we're going to replace it with.
Well, there is this notion, when people talk about disruption in this way, there is this notion of financial engineering, in a sense, in order to accumulate great wealth for the people who are undertaking that manipulation or disruption, which I think is synonyms in that sense. And so there doesn't necessarily have to be, from that point of view, a sense of vision, and I think sometimes people graft a sense of vision on top of it as a kind of dressing up or cosmetic for the desire
That's
for
why
greed.
I like that. I mean, you could say, oh yeah, the guys who did all the CDOs disrupted the mortgage market, and they created enormous wealth for themselves, but they managed to screw the rest of us pretty badly. And so I think it's so important for us all in Silicon Valley to have a sense of values. And the thing that I have found in my career, that an awful lot of the most interesting movements actually start not even with entrepreneurs, but with people who are having fun. If you look at the defining technology waves of my career that I've been part of and a booster of. Okay, start with the internet. In the early days, nobody thought there was money to be made. Think about open source software. In the beginning, nobody thought there was money to be made. After the dot-com bust, the Web 2.0 stuff we talked about, nobody thought there was money to be made. Half the people who'd been part of the previous thing were out of work, and they were doing things that they just thought were cool again. And the maker movement, and now I'm deeply involved in sort of the open government movement, where people who have been in big tech companies are going to work, for the government or working with government because they want to fix the services in our society. So it's sort of this combination of, hey, I don't care about making money. I just want to make something really cool. It's actually wonderful talk. I was just down in Puerto Rico, and it was a hackathon, a Code for America Puerto Rico chapter hackathon. They call them the Code for America Brigades. And this woman gave a talk, and it was really about, being an entrepreneur. And she said, being an entrepreneur, means that we're not waiting for somebody else to deliver what we want. We're creating our own future. And I think the way that we in technology need to think is we are creators not just of our own future, but of the future for a lot of other people. And I think we have a great deal of responsibility as the creators of the future to say, is this going to be a better future? And that doesn't mean that we don't disrupt. There's no question that, say, to take the current, disruptive darlings, Uber and Airbnb, that they are disruptive to, the taxi industry in the same way that, Amazon was disruptive to retailers or Google was disruptive to all kinds of content providers. But they're driven fundamentally by a positive vision of, wouldn't this be great for people if the world worked this way? And I think the way we talk about it, we need to celebrate not the disruption, but the creation.
So is this notion of creation and creating in a positive sense being interwoven with some sense of responsible mission? Does that underlie the various activities in which you're engaged, in which O'Reilly Media is?
Absolutely.
Can you give us some examples of companies that are having fun with the right core values and market makers and doing it for the right reason, right mission? I mean, we mentioned disruption with Uber and Airbnb, Tesla, Google. Was the Internet of Things or autonomous cars. It seems like it doesn't matter the size of the company. If organizations have the right core values and mission, they can be having fun and really creating value.
I think that's absolutely true. The thing that I would say is, in a lot of ways, that seems almost to be a stage of companies. I think the Google of 10 or 15 years ago was having a lot more fun than the Google of today. Even though Larry and Sergey really are deeply committed and values driven. I think you get to a certain size and the logic of the machine takes over. But I think there are a lot of people there who are in all these tech companies, who are super excited about what they do, and I that's what I'm drawn to, is that excitement. and you talk to some tech person, and they're wrestling deeply with a problem, and they're excited about solving that problem. That's just like meat and drink. Like I just met this morning. I'm working on a new event which I haven't announced yet. It's really about the future of work and how everything from the on-demand economy to new forms of training, augmented reality are going to change the nature of work. And it's going to be this fall in San Francisco. And I was meeting with this guy who's a chief economist at GE, and he's just like super engaged with those same problems, and it's just like, oh my God, this is so awesome. We're thinking hard about how we're going to solve these problems of the future. Met recently with Tom Pritzker, chairman of Hyatt, and you go, he's not a guy who's sitting there, being reactionary against the future. He's like grappling with the real problems of how do I transform my business, in this era where the rules are changing, and so it's everybody from old industries to new industries. There are people who are, they see the future and they're trying to guide, their company towards that future, and sometimes it's by sculpting what you're doing. I mean, I certainly, in my own career, we were originally a disruptor in publishing, and then publishing itself got disrupted, and and now we've moved into other businesses, and we've had to kind of manage, legacy and new stuff, and it's all, anyway, whatever. So it reminds me somehow, just back to the idea of having fun. Paul Hawken once wrote a book called Building a Business, and in it he said, every business has problems. The difference between a good business and a bad business is that a good business has interesting problems.
Back in when I was in high school, I wrote Paul Hawken a letter. This was way before the days of the internet, because I just admired him so much.
Yeah.
And my letter was, I'm trying to figure out what I should do. Should I get an MBA?
Yeah.
And or maybe I was in college. And he wrote back again, a paper letter, and he said, I never got an MBA, so I can't really tell you what to do. Part of what you're describing, though, it seems to me, in terms of investments and technologies and so forth, there's a time horizon element, because the entire venture, or much of the venture capital industry, is structured around very short time horizons, whereas in your case, you incubated and developed your business organically over a very long period of time.
Yeah.
So it seems like what you're describing, in some sense, to some degree, is almost incompatible with the typical venture model that just demands intense growth very fast.
Yes and no. There's the myth and the reality. The reality is that venture capitalists are betters in many cases. I mean, the really good ones actually know how to get in there and help build the company. But there's a huge amount of venture capitalists who are just like, they're sitting at the craps table and they're putting, or the roulette table, and they're putting their money on such and such and hoping, And yes, they want that exit. But the good ones know that they're building a business, and they know that they're building a business for the long term. And even when they fail, that's their ambition. And there's I actually find that there are a lot more entrepreneurs, in my opinion, who have bought into the quick flip. I mean, I guess it's actually a system, both the VCs and the entrepreneurs. But when Larry and Sergey started Google, they were not sitting there looking for the flip. They had their teeth into an interesting problem, and they were kind of doing this thing as a project, and then it kind of outgrew, and they were getting kicked out of Stanford. And you look at that, and that's like, and then some people came along and said, okay, we'll help you, become a business. and then they get some real coaching and some help, and and then they build a big world-changing business. And I think that's really the ambition of every VC, and it should be the ambition of every entrepreneur. And it doesn't have to be as big as Google. I look at my company, 500 employees, a couple hundred million in revenue. We have, I think, changed the world pretty meaningfully. There's a lot of internet companies, very big ones, where somebody says, "Yeah, I started with an O'Reilly book." And in fact, one of our slogans that came out of that, we were having a management retreat back around 2000, and Brian Irwin, again, I remember saying, "Yeah," he said, "that should be our slogan: create more value than you capture." We sold you a $35 book, and you made $1 billion business. That's a pretty awesome,
That's amazing.
It's exciting, and I love that. I remember once I was at a conference, somebody came up to me, and I didn't even remember who he was. He said, I had done something, innovative, and I was really scared I was going to lose your job. And then one of your talks, you said it was really cool, and so instead I got a promotion. And I go, I love that story. And we had that with Code for America too. I remember, we were working on open data in the first year, I think it was in Philadelphia, and this guy was like, "Well, I'm not supposed to do this, but I'm going to give you this data you're asking for." And then they made something of it, and then it was like, by the end of the year, he was a hero. And that kind of change in culture that can happen in the course of, that's a kind of disruption too. When people who have had successful jobs in high tech are now going to work in government to try to fix really hard problems. That's disruption.
Tell us about Code for America. You just mentioned it. Our audience would love to know more about that.
Yeah. First disclosure: it's founded and run by my wife, Jennifer Palka. Okay. So I'm very definitely an interested party. I'm on the board as well. But a lot of what we do, in a lot of ways, you can think about it as a Peace Corps for geeks. It started out with a program, the Code for America Fellowship, which puts small startup teams in the cities to work on interesting problems. And there's sort of a number of routes to scaling from there. Sometimes the city adopts the technology and it becomes the official program there. But we're also really looking not just at the product, but also the culture change. So they go, "Oh, we thought that was a $6 million project that we had to hire a vendor for. You did it in 6 weeks. There must be something wrong with our process." That's part of it. There's all these people who will write white papers about bringing better technology to government, but there's nothing as effective as actually demonstrating that it's possible to do, to apply these new approaches to the problems that they've been told are really hard, and you just need that Oracle upgrade, and we can do it for you. So that's one vector. Another vector is a city says, "Wow, will you keep doing this?" So we've had fellows who've gone on and started companies. So we had a project that was doing blight status, and that meant a lot of data extraction and visualization for the city of New Orleans. And now they have a business called Civic Insight that helps cities to do that kind of thing. Or Text is another company that grew out of a fellowship project where it's just, okay, how can we use text messaging to have planning departments get input from more citizens than those who show up at planning meetings. So these are sort of interesting small problems. And then, but there's other models. So we did in 2013, we worked with the city of San Francisco, city and county of San Francisco, on a problem they had with food stamps. They were like, we have this churn in the system. People apply, and then they fail to meet some requirements, and then they fall out of the program, and then they have to reapply. It's very costly for them and costly for us.
Sure.
Can you help us with this? And they go, well, can we apply for food stamps? So and they basically just debugged the process. I mean, it's just user-centered design. And then it's like, hey, we got this letter. Can you tell me what to do? Can you figure out what to do when you get this letter? And then, well, no. What am I supposed to do? Well, why do you think somebody with English, for whom English is a second language, or who dropped out of high school, or doesn't have a fixed address, is going to get this letter from your lawyers, is going to know what to do. And now they get a text message that says, there's a problem with your benefits, call the office.
Awesome.
Kind of what the letter was supposed to, and that's now grown into, we're kind of doing some work with the entire state of California to try to show them, but it's still like a big system. There's a vendor who's maintaining this, 20, 30-year-old system written in COBOL, and it's like, can you nudge that in the right direction? So, but it's sort of, there's a lot of different models here. There's now a venture fund called the GovTech Fund, which kind of came out of Code for America, where we're funding startups. And again, back to disruption, you could say, well, we're, quote, disrupting government. But no, what we're really trying to do is to actually, here's this thing. Jen gave this great talk once where she said, if we didn't care about, the problems in our society, that would be one thing. But we do care about them, and we allocate enormous resources to try to fix them. But we fail because we're doing it so badly. So a lot of, you could really say the mission of Code for America, which is nonpartisan, it's basically, you look at the scale of resources we're putting towards hard problems, whether it's, in policing or healthcare or access to social services or economic development, and you go, making those resources work more effectively actually addresses both, the Republican perspective that government is too big, and the Democratic perspective. But look, we still have all these problems. And the answer is, yeah, you're both kind of saying the same thing, which is we're allocating these resources to solve important problems, and we're allocating them badly because we're actually not bringing the latest technology to bear.
Right. These government technology problems, actually what seem to be technology problems, we had a show with our mutual friend David Bray, who is the CIO for the FCC, and Craig Newmark, who of course founded Craigslist and who's working very closely with the VA and other organizations in the government. And the focus of that conversation was on the cultural dimension, because simply changing technology alone does not address the issue of, as you were describing, contractors who have a vested interest in multi-decade projects. Yeah. So it seems like there has to be some sort of intersection between the technology and the culture, and then change agents, as David Bray describes it.
Absolutely. So celebrating and enabling and supporting change agents is a huge part of what we do. And again, that's really consistent with everything we do at O'Reilly too. Because if you look at, again, the history of some of the movements we've been involved with, in the beginning, open source was this, this thing that nobody took seriously. And being able to sort of tell a story that validated it was an important part of that acceptance. And I think, again, a big part of what I do is framing in some sense. With open source versus free software, for example, the free software narrative was, we're the rebels, we're going to destroy the evil empire. And the open source narrative was, no, actually there's a whole lot of people who are building really, really important stuff that you already all rely on. I was kind of the one who framed the open source story around the internet. It's like, you think, there's a bunch of long-haired, radicals who are going to upend the current order, but guess what? You send email, don't you? It's all being routed by this guy's program. Oh, you have a web, you have a domain name. Guess what? This long-haired guy over here wrote the software that allows that domain name, bankAmerica.com or NewYorkTimes.com, to work. Oh, you have a website. This guy led this project that probably runs your website. And all of a sudden you go, oh, this isn't this radical movement. It's just something that came from the fringes. It's already central to our lives. Let's validate it. Similarly, after the dot-com bust, I was like, why did Google succeed? Why did Amazon succeed? What are some of the principles that really mattered? It's a way of, in a way, it's kind of teaching. And that, again, is another way of thinking about what we do at O'Reilly. We're effectively a teaching and learning company. We really support entrepreneurial learners, and I don't mean just entrepreneurs as learners, but people who want to take charge of their own learning. Because so many of the technologies we cover are early stage, and they're not widely accepted yet, and you learn from your peers, and we basically just tried to accelerate that learning, originally as I said by publishing, but then later by saying, oh, let's bring all these people together so they can learn from each other and build communities of practice.
Excellent. Tim, I want to shift the conversation a little bit. Before we went live on the air, we were talking a little bit about basketball, and we're both Larry Bird fans, and I think
I'm a Warriors fan at the moment.
I'm a Warriors fan, yeah, that's right. And it was once said that, the team with the most superstars usually wins. And analogous to that, is it fair to say that companies with the most data are going to win? And I make that comment, and I want to follow up with a question from Twitter from Bilal Jaffrey, who wanted your thoughts on the Internet of Things and how that technology will impact customer experience. So importance of data and IoT in terms of customer experience.
So the first thing I would say is that with qualifications, data is an incredibly important business asset. And at the center of my narrative about what distinguished what I called Web 2.0 was this notion of data as an asset, in particular data created through user contribution, but not exclusively. I think one of my principles was data is the new Intel Inside, and that's really turned out over the last 10 years to be very true. But that doesn't mean that it's at the heart of every business. Look for example at Apple. Clearly a great business, but not a data-driven business in the way that Google is, for example. Google's entire business was around a creative new way of using data to create better results. Apple, design genius, and in some ways saying, forget the data, I'm going to create something that people are going to want. And but that being said, the context of my thoughts about data were really give you a long historical context for that. They were really formed by looking at historical analogies. I came into the industry a little before the IBM PC was introduced, and what really struck me was that there'd been this, this dominant player, IBM, controlled the hardware, and they thought that software didn't matter. And so they signed this deal with Microsoft. Microsoft realized that there was effectively a paradigm shift in which software was going to become more important than hardware. Hardware was going to become commoditized, and it did, in fact, become commoditized. And there were a lot of people who spent time, still thinking that making a computer company was making hardware and competing with IBM, and and eventually people did beat IBM there. But Microsoft went on and just sort of created a whole new game, and they then dominated the industry for decades with this paradigm that software mattered. And what I saw was that with the open protocols of the internet and with open source software was being commoditized in the same way that hardware had been commoditized before. And then I asked myself the question, well, what will become valuable now? And I came to the conclusion that it was data that was going to become valuable. And that was really the, kind of a reflection on, the kind of competitive advantage that you saw, in a company like Google. But so moving on to the Internet of Things question, in some ways, part of what comes, I don't know if it comes after data, but because data is still super important, just like software is super important and hardware is super important.
Sure.
But there's as computing starts to penetrate the real world, what's super important is the vision to understand how to re-engineer real-world processes. And there was a tweet once from Aaron Levy of Box, where he said Uber's a $3.5 billion lesson. It's now, what, $40 or $50 billion lesson in designing for the way the world ought to be rather than simply, the way it is. And you think about that. The initial, we're gonna computerize taxi cabs. It meant we'll put a little terminal in the back where you can swipe your credit card and where we can show you ads. And it was like, no, actually, we can call a car anytime, anywhere, and have it show up, because now we know where you are and where the driver is. And if you think about that, that's actually, at first people didn't get it when I would say this is the paradigmatic Internet of Things company. Because they go, where's the Internet of Things device? They go, yes, the smartphone. It's full of sensors, and the fact that both the driver and the passenger have this sensor package that they're augmenting themselves with, is the paradigm. I mean, if one of those sides, if it was a self-driving car, we'd think it was Internet of Things, or if it were the little car calling device, they'd say it was Internet of Things. But no, it just happens to be a general purpose device. But that pattern of recreating real-world processes based on the capabilities we have now, so different. We don't actually do it the way we used to. And you look at other things like Monsanto buying Climate Corp plus Precision Planting, and now we're doing this data, everything from the satellites and weather data, and we're actually saying, oh yeah, in this part of the field, you're going to put this much fertilizer on, or you're going to put the seeds this deep, and this part you're going to do it differently. The same kind of thing. It's like we have capabilities now that we don't have before. And in some ways, that kind of puts design at the center in an odd way, and not the kind of design that's about making things pretty, but the kind of design that's about what were we really trying to do here, and then everybody slaps their forehead and goes, oh wait, we didn't that part we didn't have to do. We could do it differently.
You've hit on, I think, two of the most interesting aspects of digital transformation, which is, number one, how does it affect real-world processes? How do we do things different, as opposed to digital transformation means, well, we're going to sell something on the internet and we can track the marketing numbers through analytics. So that's number one. The real world changes, and then number two is the fact that user experience becomes a central component of all of this.
Yeah, and I think that user experience is, in some ways, and obviously you can think of that narrowly as in, UX testing and so on, but in the broad way of, actually, let me back up a little bit. There's an ebook by Michael Schrage out of MIT called "Who Do You Want Your Customers to Become?" And it makes the case that great entrepreneurs actually create their customers. They make the world a place where a different kind of person exists who wants their product. So you think about it. Henry Ford, great example. He invented the weekend. He invented. I guess they had the Sabbath. But he invented. It's like there were so many things. He basically invented the idea that people would take these excursions in their cars. The kind of leisure travel industry, which formerly belonged only to rich people, was suddenly something that everybody could do in this car. And he kind of invented a different kind of world. And then you look at what Google did. They invented a world where we think we should have access to all the world's information at our fingertips. And the smartphone taking that even further. So we've all been changed in a profound way by these technologies. And I think we see that right now with companies like Uber and Lyft. This expectation that I can have on-demand transportation is a profound shift, and it's going to ripple all the way through our society. And I think the Internet of Things, so when I talk about design, I mean that kind of design. Thinking about the fact that the world could be different, and then making it so.
Yeah, on the design on the broadest sense, beginning from the point of view of what are we trying to actually accomplish here? What's the benefit that we're going to bring forth?
Right, and that's we just had at O'Reilly we're covering a lot of this in our Solid conference, which is our Internet of Things conference coming up in June. We just did an online conference yesterday called Design for the Internet of Things, and it's really how do we think about all these issues? We have these immense new capabilities, and like another good example would be the way education is changing. Khan Academy is a redesign of education. It's not just supplemental material. You all hear about the flipped classroom, for example. It's like the whole notion of like, hey, wait, let's deliver instead of delivering a lecture in class and then sending kids home with homework, we'll deliver the lecture at home and have them come in where somebody can actually work with them on their homework. So much better. I mean, if you've got kids, you realize what terrible curse homework is. And it's not really it's not well designed, whereas you get your kids to actually, watch the lecture at home, that's easy,
Absolutely.
And, so that's like a redesign, it's process redesign.
I'm incredibly impressed. I have a 12-year-old daughter, and she comes home, all her work, and it's a public school, is in the, Google Classroom in the cloud. And when her instructors grade her essays, we can actually click on these word bubbles, and the instructor's talking to us about, why they took points off here and there. And this whole adaptive learning model and the collaboration that includes the parent is incredible. You're not going to be surprised during the exam in terms of whether you feel you learn and you fully understand the topic. It's magical.
I think it goes even further. We all probably saw The Matrix. Where Trinity needs to know how to fly the helicopter and downloads the instructions.
Right.
You look at where we're going with augmented reality. That's a big piece of that. It's like sure you're not downloading it directly into your brain yet, but you're sitting there and a company like Dacry out of LA working. It's like here's a mechanic working on a jet fighter, and they've got the overlay that's showing them the what things are supposed to look like, and it's like and that really kind of just sort of brings me to this whole framing of this event I'm working at. We can use technology to disempower people, or we can use it to empower them. I've been telling this story about here's two different ways to use data with employees. One is to create micro shift work. We used to think we need you for 8 hours. Now we realize we need you for this 3 hours and this 2 hours. And by the way, you're now part-time, so we don't have to pay you benefits. Yay, we just saved money. And of course, and the employee is screwed. And the other is, what Uber and Lyft are doing. It's like they're actually exposing the data to their workers, and you talk to the Uber and Lyft driver, and what they say is they love that they're in charge. I get to decide when I'm going to work, how long I'm going to work. And so here's this old industrial model taken to its acme with, this sort of micro data-driven shift work. And on the other, with sort of all kinds of tracking of how productive you are. And the other is we're going to make a market. We're going to actually have the network rate the workers. There's all kinds of new business principles, at play there. And not only that, there's back to that design thing. Is that you're ultimately judged by did you create a better experience? And with a customer rating system in real time, it's pretty awesome and fundamental transformation in the nature of work, which doesn't mean that there are no problems with it, because as a society we've tied all kinds of safety net kinds of things to traditional employment, and so we say, oh, this is a lousy job because it doesn't have this, that, or the other safety net thing, and you go, well, who decreed that those things were only tied to traditional jobs? That's a choice we made as a society, and we can say, oh, well, this is actually a better way to organize work. Let's actually add on some of those other things.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a phenomenal conversation. Unfortunately, we're about out of time.
All right.
Michael, that was the fastest 45 minutes of my week. And God, we could have gone for another 2 hours. Tim, unbelievable insight. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, I'm glad to do it, and I've enjoyed talking with you guys.
And I hope you'll come back another time. Maybe when you're doing your Future of Work conference, you can come on CXO Talk sometime around that period, and we can talk about the future of work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you're ever in Boston, courtside seats, you know where.
Okay. All right.
All right.
All right. Take care.
You have been watching episode number 111 of CXO Talk. I'm Michael Krigsman, and my fabulous co-host, Vala Afshar. We have been joined by Tim O'Reilly, who is the founder of O'Reilly Media. Next week, we have Mark Schwartz, who is the CIO of the U.S. Citizen and Immigration Service. So everybody have a great week. Tim, thank you for taking the time today. And we'll see you next time, everybody. Bye-bye.